Hello, I'm Henry, and it's official. My sister has been transformed into a doll. A freaking plastic doll. All thanks to my eccentric parents who decided to adopt her as their daughter. My parents' peculiarities had already landed me in hot water several times, but this time it got so out of hand that I found myself standing on a bridge with my hands raised, facing the police. An officer firmly gripped my arm and slapped on the handcuffs. Fear washed over me. What fate awaited me now? Tears welled up in my eyes as I tried to explain that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. It wasn't real, but it seemed like my words fell on deaf ears. They shut the car door behind me, and I was on my way to jail. But how did I end up in this predicament in the first place? You see, I used to be an only child, but that all changed about a year ago when my mom became pregnant. She was ecstatic at the thought of me having a little sister. Unfortunately, our excitement turned to sorrow when my mom went into premature labor 7 months into the pregnancy. My parents sat me down that day and had the difficult conversation about the high likelihood that my sister wouldn't survive. Accepting that reality was incredibly hard for me, but I did accept it. When I visited my little sister in the hospital, she was so tiny, underdeveloped, and fragile. Regrettably, she didn't make it, and her passing shattered me. Life felt like it would never be the same again. Yet, amidst the grief, my mom did something extraordinary. One day, I returned home to find a baby on the table. A real baby. I called out to my mother in confusion and asked her what was going on. As I approached the baby, the truth slowly dawned on me. It wasn't a real baby at all. It was a lifelike doll, so convincing that I had to touch it to ensure my mom hadn't somehow acquired a real baby and placed it on our kitchen table. Bewildered, I questioned my mother about the presence of this doll. She chuckled and replied, "What are you talking about? That's your little sister." My mom cradled the doll in her arms and began rocking it gently. I could feel a shiver run down my spine. She introduced the doll as Lucy, and I struggled to maintain a neutral expression. I didn't want to hurt my mom's feelings, but honestly, it was beyond unsettling, and things only grew stranger from there. It felt like every time I turned around, my mom was caring for the doll. She even started conversing with it as if it were a living, breathing baby. I attempted to ignore it, but it became increasingly difficult. I thought it was bizarre enough that my mom was treating the doll as if it were real. But one morning during breakfast, things took a surreal turn. I decided to prepare my own meal since my mom seemed preoccupied with feeding the fake baby. As I opened the cupboard, I was shocked to find it stocked with nothing but jars of baby food. I couldn't believe my eyes. I sat down at the table and asked my mom if there was anything else I could eat, and then I sneezed. It was just a small, innocent sneeze due to allergies. In an instant, my mom leaped to her feet, screaming at me. She shielded the doll in her arms and accused me of trying to contaminate it. I tried to reason with her, repeating that it was just a doll, and she grabbed my wrist. I pulled away in disbelief, taken aback by the look in her eyes. I felt embarrassed and betrayed that my own mother would lay her hands on me over a doll. What had come over her? I thought that would be the end of it. I believed that, seeing the shock on my face, my mother would realize how wrong she was to treat me like that. But things only escalated. Every day when I returned home, my mom insisted that I remove my shoes and scrub myself with an aggressive antibiotic spray. She was convinced I might contaminate the doll. She even made me wear a plastic suit. It reached a point where I couldn't even be in the same room as the doll anymore. I couldn't even touch my mother anymore, let alone share a meal in the same room with her. It felt as if I were trapped, a prisoner in my own home. Then, one fateful day, I returned home to find my room stripped bare. Every piece of furniture had vanished, replaced by an image of Lucy painted on the wall in an elegant font. My mother explained it away as excessive drafts in the nursery, forcing me to move to the basement where they kept Lucy. It was unfathomable. I was being relocated because of a doll. The desire to yell and scream surged within me, but the fear of my mother's wrath held me back. For a brief moment, things seemed to settle down. We endured this peculiar arrangement for several weeks. I kept my distance from my mother, slept in the basement, and sought sustenance at friends' houses. It was far from ideal, but as a senior, I clung to the hope that I could endure and graduate, perhaps finding a moment of happiness during my senior pictures with my family. However, what followed was nothing short of a nightmare. On the day designated for our family portrait at school, my mother walked into the studio pushing a baby carriage. I was mortified. My friends, teachers, and their families gathered nearby, observing the spectacle as my mother wheeled in the doll. When it was time for the photograph, my mom insisted that Lucy had to be included. I began to unravel, telling her that I couldn't allow it. My mother berated me for disrespecting my baby sister. I shouted back, asserting that my real baby sister was gone and Lucy was just a ridiculous doll. All eyes were on me, some laughed, while others were horrified. But my overriding emotion was anger, and it wouldn't subside. I picked up the doll, ready to hurl it across the room. My mother screamed, her sobs echoing in the room. She implored me to leave and never return. I rushed home, a desperate need to escape my family's madness driving me to pack my belongings hastily. My initial plan was to stay with a friend, but as soon as I opened my phone, I realized that option was off the table. My social media feeds were ablaze with activity. Someone had taken a GIF of my outburst and transformed it into a merciless meme that had gone viral. The onslaught was relentless, with people hurling insults and posting doll pictures while tagging me in them. It was an avalanche of cyberbullying, and I found it increasingly difficult to endure. I did my best to ignore the online torment, reassuring myself that one day, when I was old enough, I would leave this chaotic household for good. However, my breaking point arrived when I discovered that my parents had brought in a psychologist to treat me for my unwillingness to accept Lucy as a part of our family. The following day, I overheard my mom and dad returning home. I hid in the closet, biding my time until they retired for the night. I knew what I had to do, and it was clear in my mind that this was all the fault of that foolish doll. It was time to take decisive action. Once I was sure they were asleep, I made a determined dash to my former bedroom, snatched up the doll, and without a second thought, I raced outdoors. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, realizing that if my mother caught me before I accomplished my mission, it would be too late. As I made my way across town, a few passers-by stopped me, curious to see my baby. I snapped at them all in frustration, unable to fathom how they could mistake the doll for a real infant. Panic began to set in. I needed to dispose of the doll discreetly, ensuring it would never be found again, thus allowing my life to return to normal. I reached a bridge that spanned the river to the other side of town and paused, hearing the rushing water below. In hindsight, this might not have been the wisest plan, but desperation clouded my judgment. My singular focus was on ending the ridicule and earning my mother's attention. With a heavy heart, I began to traverse the bridge, ready to rid myself of the doll once and for all. However, my heart raced as 4 police cars screeched to a halt right in front of me, their sirens deafening and my fear palpable. One of the officers barked at me to get on the ground, and I obeyed, feeling the handcuffs tighten around my wrists moments later. I was utterly bewildered. Who did they mistake me for? What was happening? Tearfully, I tried to explain my situation, but my words came out incoherent. Panic welled up inside me, and I wondered if my life was on the line. Someone kept demanding to know where the baby was, and then it hit me like a ton of bricks. They genuinely believed the doll was a real infant. I attempted to clarify, to make them understand it was just a doll, but my words fell on deaf ears, hindered by my overwhelming emotions. The officer placed me in the back of the police car and confiscated the doll. I sobbed, consumed by fear, convinced that I was headed for jail. Upon arrival, I found myself confined to a holding cell, surrounded by darkness. My life had spiraled out of control in an unimaginable way. The school viewed me as a freak, my mother was an enigma, and now I was in custody. I couldn't fathom how my life had unraveled so rapidly. After several hours, someone entered the interrogation room and sat down with me, a social worker. He began showing me pictures of the doll my parents had, repeatedly asking what I saw. It was baffling. Why was he fixated on the doll? 2 burly men then appeared and forcibly removed me. When I regained consciousness, my limbs were securely bound to a hospital bed. I found myself in a psychiatric hospital, where I remained for a month before my parents finally visited me. My initial instinct was to lash out at them, but then I noticed something that left me dumbfounded. It was the doll, or so I thought. But when my mother approached, I realized to my shock that it wasn't a doll. It was a real, living baby. A genuine, breathing baby. Had my parents somehow obtained a real baby? My mother explained that Lucy had nearly succumbed during childbirth, and I had prematurely accepted her death. In reality, Lucy had survived, and my denial had led to delusions. It all started to make sense. It was me. Something was amiss with my mental health. I began to recollect memories of my mother keeping me away from the baby, relocating my belongings to a different room, and the bewildered gazes of my relatives when I claimed my sister was a doll. Overcome with emotion, I hugged my mom and wept. From that moment on, I embarked on a new path. I adhered to my medication regimen and my mental health stabilized. It was a revelation. As for your question about grief, yes, I had to grapple with it. Grief can manifest in complex and unexpected ways, affecting not only our emotional well-being but also our perceptions of reality.